because it was, the barrier to entry was high, they would get 2 or 3 videos sent to them each week. So if you made a music video to any standard, you would be on the TV.
Mark's generously joined us this morning and is going to share some of his story. As we go, think of, if questions pop up in your mind, then we'll have a bit of time at the end for those. Give us the big picture. Where are you now? What does it look like?
I've never done anything but this. So I kind of started the company when I was 19. I'm now 37. Sort of gets a bit lost after 35. But it was never always a serious thing. It was just kind of helping friends, and kind of Duncan can definitely attest. It was just wanting to be around creative, wanting to be around artists, but sadly not having any musical gifts or ability. So the other option was kind of selling merch or tour managing or whatever you call it. And so it wasn't serious really for the first 5 or 6 years. It was messing around, and then by coincidence became a bit more serious. We're a record label really in the traditional sense, although hopefully we're a very digital kind of focused company and forward thinking company. We're a record label like you would have found, I suppose in the heyday, 70s or 60s and 70s. We're in we don't get too much into the weeds, but we're in the master recordings business. So really we partner with artists and sign agreements to, the term is exploit the recordings. That sounds kind of a bit crass sometimes when you're in the wrong sense, but that is so they give us permission effectively for a set amount of years, for 10 years or 12 years to kind of license an album or 2 albums or whatever it might be, and it's our job then to maximize and amplify what that is. So every time you stream it on Spotify or buy a vinyl record or hear it on the radio or in an advert or something, then that's hopefully been us helping kind of grow their career and work alongside the other parts of our industry, which is the publishing business and the live business. So artists tend to have teams that encompass age and manager and so on, and it's our job to be over here kind of working the recordings.
And you have a global footprint now.
Yeah, obviously it's a very global industry. We're beholden to social media, we're beholden to TikTok and Instagram and things like that. And generally, when you see spikes and you have viral moments, it's US driven. So you certainly need your people on the ground in the US. My business partner's based out in New York, and has been a director of our company for 10 years now. Whilst it's a balance, we definitely love our British music, and needless to say, I'm a big advocate for non-London music industry where I can be, and so we definitely work enough out of Manchester, Liverpool, Scotland, Ireland. There's amazing scenes, and you often find like those artists that. If you're a buzzy act in London, you tends to be 250 industry people, or it's a small room full of it. Whereas, if you find a buzzy act in Glasgow or in Dublin or something like this, it's 1,000 fans. Even quite early in their career, you can kind of scale quite quickly.
Wow. So, and what sort of artists are you working with now? So
it's a mix. I come from a guitar place, a rock kind of place. That's my from those formative years, that's kind of what I love, and there's a lot of that across the roster, but it's not, we're always really careful not to over-index in one area. We love surprising people. Last year, kind of our proudest moment was on the 5th of April, early in April, we released, a band, an album from a band called The K's, which is like indie, they're an indie band out of the north of England, and then the following week, we released a trying soundtrack by a pop artist called Becca, which is an Apple TV series made by the BBC. And we just love being able to like surprise, and people say, "Oh, a company your size, you must focus on one thing. You must focus on just do rock or just do northern indie." But we love being able to push back on that a little bit and kind of surprise. So yeah, if there's a gap in the roster somewhere, or then it's always tempting to, try something new.
And what sort of at any one time, how many artists do you kind of represent?
So it's always a little bit of a revolving door, in the sense of, if you're, hopefully the football analogy will work in this room. So we are, if I'm being very generous to us, we are sort of a lower championship club, second tier club. Some people would probably say we're League One, but I would say we're a lower championship club.
Like a Sheffield Wednesday.
Exactly. I'm a Blackpool fan, so there was a time when that analogy worked. Now, not so much. But yeah, Sheffield Wednesday is probably a good one. When you have a player, forgive me, this is coming back around, stay with me. When you have a player that's doing very well, and Liverpool or Manchester City or something are interested, it's going to be quite hard to, as Sheffield Wednesday or as Blackpool, to kind of keep that player. So we have a kind of revolving door for those with deeper pockets, but our catalogue ownership remains the same. So if you do a couple of EPs with us, or you do an album with us, and then you go and sign to, Interscope, or you go and sign to whatever, we retain that, and that benefits us, but it also benefits the artist, because sometimes when you're getting into bed with those larger corporations, there are strings attached. They certainly will give you a big check on the front end for the most part, but sometimes, not always, but sometimes that's where the relationship, that's the best bit. And so us paying you, every month or every quarter on our catalogue sometimes is a cash flow thing that's really meaningful to an artist. So that's a very long way of answering the question. 10 to 12 at any one time. But yeah, always kind of juggling that. We have a couple at the moment that there's kind of 5 or 6 songs left on our deal, and we know, because people are ringing us, that there will be interest, and people are asking the question, how many's left on, how many songs you got left.
So do you get to do the football analogy a bit more? Do you get like a transfer fee?
Good question. So it depends where they are in deal. If we can be bought out. If there's enough left in our deal, then there has been situations where we've been bought out. I won't mention the artist, but there was a situation a couple of years ago where RCA paid us to just not release the music, because it was actually more kind of pop-oriented artist, and they didn't love the direction of the record we had made. The irony is the artist released like 3 singles on RCA and then was dropped. So, it's quite ironic that they had such strong feelings about at the records we had made. So in that instance, yes, that's kind of what you would call a transfer fee. In other situations where our deal is running down, so this one that I just referenced, where there's kind of, a handful of songs left, I suspect what will happen is they will let that run its course, and we will retain that catalogue, which is, good for us. And as I say, good, I'm biased, but very good for the artist. And then I suspect what will happen is the artist will then be free to, a free agent, if you will, to go and sign.
On a Bosman.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
All right. Well, we've got a picture of where Lab Records is now, and rewind to where did it all start?
Yeah. So, like I say, I was not musically gifted and wanted to help. I was brought up sort of near Blackpool. There wasn't much of a scene, and the scene that there was, was kind of quite severe, like punk and ska and things like this. I don't know if that means anything to...
Well, we had John Robb.
Oh, well, yeah, that was a great reference for that.
To us. He's from Blackpool and loves punk. So.
Yes, quite. Yeah, John was probably pretty responsible for that scene, or the tail end of that. So, me and my friends had to come to Manchester to see the shows we wanted to, which when you can't drive and stuff is fine, but not ideal. So we found ourselves kind of putting on shows in Blackpool, and there was kind of modest success. When I say that, there would be 150 kids at these, but artists used to be pleasantly surprised by that. I think they would be coming expecting there to be 20 people in the room or something.
And how old are you at this point?
17, 18. And so just kind of, it was scary to give £150 guarantee. Do you know what I mean? It was like terrifying, that was like the top end of what we would pay a kind of headline artist. So it would be probably a little bit extreme to say we created our own scene, but there was a little bit of a movement, and through that met more and more artists that were coming out of kind of terrible record deals and had managers and things, and so it just happened organically. Like, will you help us press 500 CDs or 1,000 CDs or 300 vinyl or something, and through that just automatically start a record label, just by default.
So we're what, mid 2000s?
Yeah, 2007, 2006, 2007. Yeah.
So just to remind us of the landscape, Spotify doesn't exist yet.
That's right.
YouTube's just launched.
Yes.
But doesn't have loads of traction.
Yes.
Probably MySpace is the music.
Yes, now you're
Anyone
speaking
remember
my language.
MySpace?
Yeah. 100%.
So some people are going, I wasn't born, and some people are going, I remember having.
Yeah.
Paint the picture for us then, because you're like, we're pressing CDs. Some people are going, what?
Yeah. So you're quite right. You could kind of pure volume is, if you want to go real deep. I'm sure Duncan remembers pure volume, but MySpace, and we were judged on how many HMV shop floors can we get the CD in. Do you know what I mean? And so on a priority release, on a something we would bring in from the US or something, if you could be in 85% of HMV shop floors, you'd be getting a kind of pat on the back. And there's another story about the biggest record we'd worked at the time, a band called He Is Legend out of the US. And, I had got a pat on the back because we got it into all these HMV shop floors, and we'd pressed 3,000 CDs, which at the time was like so many more than we'd ever kind of pressed before. And got a phone call from the distributor at the time to say, we're getting a lot of messages about the record sounding different to, or the single, one of the songs on the record sounding really different to a song that we'd put on the CD of Rock Sound, which was a magazine. I think it still exists, maybe digitally. But at the time it was, in W.H. Smith's, you got Rock Sound, and there would be a free CD on the front. And people say, it sounds very different to, the song that you put on, the same song, but people are saying it's slower. And somehow on our 3,000 CDs, there was like, someone had pushed a button. I have no idea why the button exists, but where it was sort of 15% slower than it should have been. So the song should have been like bat, 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 and it was like bat, 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 and it was just sort of like annoyingly noticeable. So the heartbreaking phone call where you have to like recall your 3,000 CDs, get the jewel cases at the time, the plastic jewel cases, and put the new CD, in, and then ship and tell the manager, oh, by the way. So that gives you a little bit of insight. It was obviously live drove everything, and MySpace and social media was just starting to have an impact, and you started to see that correlation between this artist is blowing up on MySpace, and look, now they sell this many tickets, and that was at the time quite a concept that could become something tangible, and that could become something in real life. But of course, streaming a song on MySpace, you were paid zero, so Spotify was a novel concept at that stage, that we're going to come in and pay you, and Spotify gets a lot of heat, and in some ways rightfully so. But people need to remember that you could have millions of streams on MySpace or on Pure Volume and be paid zero.
And at that time, piracy's huge, wasn't it? Things like LimeWire, I didn't have that. But LimeWire and stuff that people are going, oh yeah.
Yeah.
Remember?
30+ crowd.
Yeah. Everyone's going there. You had, even if you cast your mind back then, we had mini discs, or MP3 is going to be the format. We had the iPod just coming out. So loads of changes happening. I'm interested, you said you're 18, 19, mm-hmm. You suddenly find yourself with a record label. Ish.
Yeah.
Something's happening.
Yeah.
But you're finding artists in America
Hmm.
and getting them into shops in HMV throughout the UK.
Hmm.
As an 18-year-old, that seems like a remarkable. How how are you? First of all, how are you finding artists in
Yeah.
America? How are you contacting, bringing them over, and then who at HMV is taking you seriously?
Yeah, so yeah, quite a good question. It was surprising. Yeah, funny enough. I mean, all this comes back to present day. Talk about mini disc. Sam Fender just put out a mini disc of the new record. I think they sold. Someone told me, don't quote me. Someone told me they sold like 300 or something. Like he sold 110,000 units first week and 300 mini discs. But yeah, it kind of is surprising for sure but at the time I think divvying up rights, now people would be paranoid about giving away like UK rights or something, because something can catch fire anyway anyhow. If something goes on TikTok and you've given away the UK European rights, you look stupid. At the time, if someone was willing to work your relatively niche American rock band, even if you were selling 1,500 tickets in markets in the US, if someone was willing to stick their hand up and say, we want to go almost door to door, we want to kind of bang the desk and root for this record, I think people were pretty inclined to take that risk. Oftentimes, in terms of a physical release, maybe there wasn't going to be a UK or European physical release unless we did it. And we had a small distributor at the time, Code 7 Plastic Head, who kind of took a chance on us. But it was very simple. It was, let's start with 500 units often. Let's start with 1,000 units. Do you want some ad space in Kerrang? Do you want some ad space in, this is what it costs? And it was, no more complicated than.
So are you on the phones?
Yeah, it's email, yeah, but phones as well, and yeah, you could do it all with, in terms of getting to the distributor, getting to 2 or 3 contacts, and you were of the right people, and you were okay, and a lot of those people, particularly in the physical space, are still in the same seats they were, back then. Physical has come back around and is now an increasing part of our business. I don't need to tell you the margin on a vinyl record is infinitely greater than a song stream or even a digital download, which still some people do. If you can, it never fails to amaze me on Bandcamp, like people download WAV files, download MP3 files in 2025. Like it's wild. But they, there is a kind of core group of people who hark back to that and still love that and don't necessarily want, maybe they use Spotify as a research tool, but they don't want to just exist, their musical life on Spotify. They feel like it's detached.
So in that early phase of the label, what was the strategy? What was the idea of getting stuff out? I know video. So Mark is referencing Duncan. Duncan's our head of video at Doodle Doo, who actually would never have picked up a video camera at all were it not for Mark. So
that's very kind. I'm not sure I can take credit for that.
He told me that earlier.
Yeah, that's very kind.
So give us a picture of what your strategy was and why it, probably record labels, certainly small indies, came and went, but you're still here. You had an idea.
It's kind to suggest at that time there was a strategy, but I think it was just, you have to trust your ear. You have to kind of work what you were into. And now, well, at that time it was working what you're into. Now I kind of have to, take myself. The general demographic of our artists is 16 to 25. So I have to use my imagination, or we have to use our collective imaginations a little bit and kind of take ourselves back to. But it's very easy, I'm sure, when you're listening to, anyone in this room, when they're listening to music, it's very, very simple to take yourself back to those formative years. And, if you listen to a record from when you were 16 or 17, it's you start to recall other things that you experienced at that time. So it's quite easy to do. But at that stage, it was really just about, finding people that we found to be, we were into the records, but we also found them to be charming, and they were willing to kind of pound the pavements like we were. We would at that stage joining bands on the road a lot, and so it was very personal thing. You would be standing at, the merch desk, kind of trying to convince people to buy a CD. Do you know what I mean? It's like being a market seller or something. Is the equivalent of that, really, just to kind of pay for the travel lodge that night or whatever. And in terms of growing the business, yeah, you're right. It was starting to get to, obviously, kind of a big line in the sand there would be Facebook, and would be, kind of the more towards what we would know as modern social media. And I think that's where people started to think about conversions more than MySpace, where it was just like, throwing songs up and crossing your fingers and kind of hoping for the best. I think, with Facebook came ads, and so people started to realize that there was a route to kind of monetizing. And then, that's where you get to kind of the early stages of YouTube. At that point, it was quite, and this is where Duncan does come into the story, because at that, it was hard to make music videos. There's a company that still exists now, still has a good business now, called Sitcom Soldiers in Bolton. And, if we, for our biggest acts at the time, we would scrimp and save. This was kind of before Duncan was shooting music videos, and Sitcom would charge, $3,000 for a music video. I'm sure it was at the bottom end of there, but that was, to us, the concept of spending $3,000 on a music video was just insane. But we would, for our top artists, we would scrimp and save. And, when you were submitting to the TV channels were a big thing at that stage, Kerrang and Scuzz and all that still existed. And they would maybe get, because it was, the barrier to entry was high, they would get 2 or 3 videos sent to them each week. So if you made a music video to any standard, you would be on the TV. Like, there was, do you know what I mean? It wasn't like now where everyone can shoot, content, shoot music videos to a good standard. So there was I remember vividly, there was a channel called Lava, and it was a free phone line to ring up and request your music video on the TV. So we would sit there through the afternoons and just literally spend the whole time just ringing up. We would have, maybe 3 or 4 music videos of ours on rotation. And honestly, I'm not exaggerating. Who knows who was watching this thing? But I'm not exaggerating when I say our 3 or 4 videos played just constant loop, because we would sit there, Skype, RIP, I think it's just about to, had like a free phone thing. And so we would sit there on our laptops and just dial. And do you know what? At the time, I remember sitting there going, no one is watching this apart from us. But then, sure enough, in the weeks and months later, people would come out to shows. People would, you would notice the growth of fan base. And it's like, actually, someone is sitting there watching Lava. I can't remember your question. Sorry.
Nor can
I. Yeah.
No, I think it was about that strategy and using video. So I had imagined that it was more online than TV, but sounds like.
And after that, obviously, YouTube starts to come into the equation and starts to become a big deal. Vivo was and still exists, but at the time was the be all and end all, because the top artists in the world were on this platform, Vivo, who was kind of part YouTube, but they also had their own player. And so all of our artists wanted to be on there because Taylor Swift or whoever, huge artist, Lady Gaga, was or even the biggest artists in our scene, were on Vivo, and they had editorial placements where so you could quite quickly get a video, to 50,000 views or 100,000 views, and that created hype in the industry. Why is this band I've never heard of, post a music video 3 or 4 days ago and it looks good and it has 100,000 views, suddenly that, catches the attention of industry people.
So then the streaming platforms come on board, to Spotify, Apple Music, all that. So how did that change things for you?
I think at first it was just supplementary. It was like, let's put stuff on Spotify. It obviously began as quite a niche thing, and
did you resist it or did you embrace it?
Not really. We just kind of, again, any extra eyeballs, and at the time, the royalty check would come in, and it would almost be a surprise. Oh, there was £200 from Spotify, or from DSPs, so Spotify and the other ones. this month, like, and you wouldn't rely on it. You would just be like, oh yeah, like, that's cool. And then, needless to say, that number started to grow, and it probably by, gosh, 2014, 2015, that, it was number one on the call sheet. All of a sudden, it was, you were changing your release strategy around streaming, and editorial placements became everything. New Music Friday, it wasn't New Music Friday at the time, but New Music Friday became the bane of your existence, because if you're not there, you have a hard day. And if you're not on the so I don't know if people are aware of this, every week in each of the territories, Spotify posts New Music Friday. The other DSPs do the same, and there's usually about 100 songs or thereabouts, which are, in Spotify's mind, the 100 biggest songs, or not biggest songs you need to hear, shall we say, that week. And this is very meaningful to artists, to managers, to be on this list. And so Thursday night tends to be, a bit of the worst sleep of the week, really, which is such a strange thing, because you're so out. It's, not really in our hands.
How do you manipulate that?
So we have we've been with our distributor for 7 or 8 years. It's a company called ADA, so it's independent, but we're independent, but they're owned by Warner Music Group. So it's our job first to sell a record into ADA, and it's their job really to go to the DSPs, to go to Spotify and say, this is an important record, and this is why. And then we will also reach out to our people at Spotify and at Apple and so on. But it's out of your hands, really. All you can do is, and I have this conversation with managers all the time, all we can do, we have the same process by design every single week, we put it in front of these people and, pitch it in the same way, and they're either into it or they're not, or they think it's meaningful, or they don't, or they understand it, or they don't. But yeah, it's still streaming is very, very important. It's what we're judged on a lot of the time, but now I think we're back at creating these really rounded campaigns, and what we're all searching for in our business is an artist that streams well, sells tickets, is played on the radio, sells vinyl. That's what we're all, can make music for TV, is used in Netflix shows, or holiday adverts. That's what we're all. That's the kind of golden ticket, really. But those ones come around every so often, and when they do come around, everyone wants to sign them. So that's what we're shooting for.
Brilliant. And how has sort of video changed in your sort of 20 years nearly?
So if you come up,
you're using it very differently now than you would have.
Yeah, if you come up to kind of the present day, or certainly, I think COVID was obviously changed things a lot. It won't be a surprise to anyone that our industry is really beholden to like TikTok and Reels, Instagram. If you look at the singles chart, there will almost, I haven't looked at it recently, but there will almost be nothing there that isn't driven by TikTok. It's almost impossible to have a hit record that isn't a TikTok moment in some way, shape, or form. It used to be a big TV placement, or being the James Bond theme or something would create that. There's so much saturation in TV and streaming now that's having less of it. Occasionally that will be meaningful. There was Kate Bush, Stranger Things, I think is probably the one that comes immediately to mind. But yeah, if you look at all the modern music on there, it's all had a TikTok moment of some description. So that's really how we're breaking artists. And
are those organically viral, or are those manufactured?
It's a great question. The best ones are organic, and they come from fan, and it's very difficult to sit around in a room like this and think, right, it's almost impossible, in fact, because everyone at every major label with infinite budget is trying to do it every day, to sit around and go, right, what's our viral moment on this?
Yeah.
On this song, and sometimes people with literally millions of pounds of marketing budget are unable to get that away. So us little guys have kind of no shot. But so the best ones come from kind of a fan moment. But I think what we're shooting for, listen, if we can have, and we've been lucky enough to have a kind of handful of viral moments, and maybe half a dozen or more, I think that will happen. But what we're shooting for more than that, instead of chasing just pure views, is like, can we create, even if the videos are getting 10,000 views a piece or 50,000 views a piece instead of millions and millions, if that 50,000 is in our, in our wheelhouse, and they are people that have a shot at buying a ticket, buying a t-shirt, being a long-time supporter of the band, of the artist, then that's almost better. I'll never turn down a viral moment, if it's going to be presented, but that's almost better, and it's more attainable. And there's also far too sort of nuanced and deep for today, really. But there's also a kind of mental health conversation around TikTok and Reels rewards very consistent posting. So there's this huge expectation on artists to post day in, day out. Some of our artists post multiple times a day. And when you stop, almost always the graph goes like that. The data goes like that. So there's this huge expectation on artists. And even those artists with a much bigger budget and bigger team than ours would have, no one can kind of force you, a lot of it is self-shot. A lot of it is, and whilst you might have a massive team, they're not around you every day at 9 a.m. We need to think about that, and that's something that we try and be quite self-aware on. But that's how it's changed. We're shooting less of the stuff we did with Dunk, the music videos. That still happens occasionally, but all those TV channels sadly no longer exist. So there's less of an outlet. People's attention spans are shorter. So oftentimes when we are shooting a music video, a big part of the question is, how are we chopping this up? Making sure that we have the vertical content. Are we getting behind the scenes? Are we getting, all that stuff for our social platforms?
And so by nature, the duration of these
the duration is much shorter. The duration of songs in general, if you do that research, has been hugely reduced. If you look at the top 10 singles chart, the average used to talk about 3.5 minutes. When I was kind of first in the industry, that very often now songs will be sub 2 minutes. And in fact, there was a real pattern a couple of years ago where sub 1 minute songs were outperforming algorithmically on Spotify. We had an artist, Tommy Lefroy, who had one song was 59 seconds and one song was 67 seconds or something, and the algorithm loved them because it is generally, it's much more complicated than this, but to my mind, it's about saves and skips. So if people are not skipping the song, they are playing it from start to finish, and then they are, because it's so short and hopefully good, they are hitting repeat. Fantastic news algorithmically, and then they are saving it. Fantastic news. So these songs started to outperform because by the time it crescendoed, by the time it got to the point where you might think about skipping, it was done. So that's another question artistically.
So are we at a stage now where artists are writing for the platform?
Yeah. For sure they are. People are thinking a lot more about, obviously TikTok lends itself to like very quick kind of lyrical moments, almost very often controversial lyrical moments, and it's not my world, but artists like sort of Central C and things like that have this thing where it's a clever line, sometimes a controversial line, a few that can be clipped. And there's countless artists but for sure people are thinking about how they're writing for social and for TikTok.
So the days of long musical intros are dead.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. It's kind of almost saturated to the point where artists are starting to push back and say, do you know what? Certainly our artists that would be less interested in things like the singles chart or whatever. Do you know what? We're not going to play that game. We're going to make this regular. But still, there's certainly times where we have a conversation and say, look, not just for social, also for Spotify, we kind of need to get to the first vocal part quickly. Can we chop this in? What's the point of this intro? Can we chop it in? If we chop it in half, does that devalue it enough Do you see what I'm saying? Like, and sometimes the artist is the boss, certainly in our world, and it's not worth our time. Again, to really overuse that football analogy, if you have a one-to-way striker, if you have an unhappy, star player, they almost always get the move. Do you know what I mean? Or they almost always leave the club. So it's our job to keep that star striker kind of happy. And if a 30-second intro on one song makes them happy, then generally we will fold in that argument.
What's been a sort of career highlight for you?
Wow. Gosh, it's been so slow and so long that it's hard to kind of pinpoint one moment. I think, without sounding really twee, I'm just happy that we still get to do it. The best moments for us and for anyone who works in A&R or works in kind of signing things is when you go from seeing something in front of a handful of people to seeing, when you have that kind of movie moment where there's sometimes it's 1,500 people, sometimes it's 3,000 people, and they're kind of singing the songs back, and you kind of have the snapshot of what it used to be. Then that's always like, you can't get sick of that. That's kind of why we do it, basically. But in terms of, we had some chart success last year in the albums chart, and hopefully more to come this year, and that's always, fans don't care about that, but that's always like a nice when you're up, so we had a record that was UK number 3, and all week until the last day we were above. It was Beyonce week 2 with the country album that has like 1,000 songs on it, which I think's cheating if you're Beyonce, but anyway, all week we were number 2. Libertines was number 1, and we were never going to catch Libertines, but we were number 2 6 out of the 7 days, and then Beyonce got us on the last day. But just to be talked about, that's the equivalent of, when you're a minnow kind of in the FA Cup or whatever, like a small team, just to be talked about in those conversations. And when you have something like that, which goes out to all the trade press and stuff, and you've been in this for 20 years or whatever, like the number of people who reach out and you're like, oh my God, I've never not spoken to you in like 5-10 years, that's wild. How are you going? But I would say that. But like I say, it's been such a slow climb. It's kind of hard. We haven't had our sometimes, maybe in any industry, but sometimes in music you have a one overnight thing. I'm not sure we've ever had that. Do you know what I mean? Like it's been a steady climb, but hopefully we're bigger than we've ever been. And as you say, a lot of people, for whatever reason, can't make it work. It can be quite tough economically if you're not tight like I am with recording budgets and stuff. And so to just, it sounds really twee, but to just be existing is in our game is not a given.
Yeah. What does the future, from your perspective, look like in the music industry? Is AI gonna? It's a conversation in every sector.
Yeah.
But what are the conversations you're having?
It's really hot topic, obviously, and it's a really kind of controversial topic. I think true artists are rightly terrified by AI because they, worry that it's going to devalue kind of what they're doing, even on like a very core level of I don't know, recording drums. If you're a drummer, you're pretty worried about that. Do you know what I mean? But I think that ultimately people are going to want to see the recording process documented more than ever before, because they're going to want to see that, those 4 people or however many are in the band put their heart and soul into this record. And I still think it's always a two-way thing. We have, in terms of our biggest acts, we have to think a little bit about the mainstream and what we would call passive listeners, casual listeners who are listening in a coffee shop or in the gym or, whatever. Mm-hmm. And then what we call super fans, who are that kind of, me when I was 17 and going to HMV and spending my, the government used to give us £30 a week for turning up at college. It's a great concept, and I used to take it to HMV and buy 3 CDs, basically. But that, you know, so I'm imagining me, you know, who is that 10%, and how are we serving them? How are we monetizing them? But less cynically, how are we giving them the best possible experience? Can we give them access to stuff first? Can we, you know, if people are coming out, someone just did their 100th show of an artist of ours in the last kind of couple of weeks. And, you know, that person we need to reward. Do you know what I mean? How can we, yeah.
So is live going to be more and more?
Yeah, good. That's the part you just can't replicate, right? I don't know if you have, you know, if you guys are music fans, but I think that kind of, when you're at an amazing show of an artist that you love, and maybe your loved one is there or your friends are there, that kind of feeling is pretty hard to replicate. You can watch Glastonbury on the TV and it's still good, and some would argue it's better because you're not covered in mud and it didn't just cost you thousands of pounds, whatever. But it's a different feeling to when you're in the thick of it, right? And for me, I love when our artists get to arenas, or you know, or supporting in arenas or stadiums, but it's not the same as when they're playing the Deaf Institute, or and seeing like a buzzy act that people are just getting into and singing the words along, you know, and you know, oftentimes you see the artist is, maybe it's the first time they're hearing the lyrics sung back to them, and it's an incredible moment for them too. And that feeling is just, yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know enough about AI to comment, but I'm not sure how it's going to replicate that. I think it's going to be more in like the recording process. You know, there's a huge amount of data analytics in our game, in our business now. And I suspect that is where it will come into the industry side when you're analyzing, you know, which artist is moving on Spotify or which artist is moving on TikTok or whatever. I think that's where it will be used. But in terms of the future, I think I think people are pushing back from streaming. We're seeing a lot more vinyl records bought, not sometimes to play, but sometimes as a keepsake, you know, and, you know, I see a lot of our records on people's walls of their office, framed. You know, and you're almost selling like an art piece, you know, and, yeah, of course, some people will tell you that vinyl sounds better and it's all about kind of playing it on there, you know, and it has to be black vinyl because that sounds different and all that. But yeah, we just made a liquid filled vinyl for a record we have coming out in June. So people are doing different, you know, and that's less about the sonics and more, you know, it's not gimmicky is the wrong way of phrasing, but that's really interesting to people because they don't see it very often.
Yeah.
You know, yeah.
Any questions?
Hey, I'm quite interested to hear your take on like how we as like an audience can better support artists to carry on doing what they're doing.
Great question.
I know, like, say, like in the Brits, there was conversational pieces about how like other big record labels were not actually treating their artists very well and not paying them like what they deserve and that kind of thing. And obviously that's kind of gone under like quite a microscope of like looking at how artists can do better. Like say when I go to a show, a lot of artists will actually speak quite vocally about please buy my merch because that's where I make my money and like they're not making it through tickets. So I'm quite interested to hear your take on like how we as an audience can actually better support the artists that we want to hear more from.
Great question.
They can keep doing what they do.
I wish more people were asking that question. So the good news on the recording contract front is there is absolutely a trend that's moving towards artists. You know, going are the days where you have these horrible major label recording contracts where, you know, they're just never going to recoup and dodgy accounting practices. So the good news is that more people are moving towards our model, which is a true partnership with the artist and kind of a net receipt split and things like that. So I think it might take 5 years to work through all the nonsense, and some people are in deals that they signed some time ago and all that. But I think in the next 5 years, those are going to become a hell of a lot fairer, and artists are going to actually see, you know, be paid a royalty on their recordings as they all should be. But to your point, I take your point about tickets, and there's a I think next on the chopping block are the Live Nations of the world. Well, they're already on the chopping block, but more so are the Live Nations of the world, are the ticket aggregators. I think that is really becoming under scrutiny. And so hopefully what goes hand in hand with that is the artist gets better compensated for. But I still think going to the shows is really important because there's a growth. If the artist is not selling tickets because people are worried about, Live Nation or Ticketmaster or whoever getting their cut, then there's no way that artist grows, because if you're selling less tickets than the tour before, less opportunities are afforded to you. Certainly the most direct way is going to a show and buying. I don't think there's probably a more direct way than going to a show and buying something on that merch desk. That is hard to beat. But even in a less quantifiable way, streaming the artist, yes, they probably aren't seeing a huge amount of royalties from that, but that monthly listener figure that you see at the top of Spotify has meaning in terms of their slot at Reading and Leeds, or their slot at Glastonbury, or that will be taken into consideration. And if they have Bandcamp, or if they have Patreon, or if they're an artist that does that kind of thing, that's probably a pretty direct way to do it as well. Yeah.
Great question.
Awesome.
I was just thinking about how the landscape in which you started out when you were like 17, 18 is just so radically different from the landscape now.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about things like, going out and just shooting videos, phoning what they called lava.
Yeah, right.
And things like that. And there are sort of certain things when I started out freelancing, which is first time round, which is like 28 years ago. Most of it was pre-Spotify, pre-streaming. There were no multi-channels. Everything was done through phone calls, email, fax, things like that.
Yellow pages.
Yeah.
How would you, if you were 17 or 18 now, how would you approach starting it?
I'm a bit of a hypocrite with this answer because my personal brand's pretty terrible. I don't update. I don't think I've posted on Instagram since 2018 or something. I post stories sometimes, but I think it's hard as a 17 or 18-year-old now to become. I can only speak for our business. I think you need a personal brand of some kind. I was lucky that I didn't have to do that, and we're at a point now where I can probably get away with it. Our label has socials, but it's mainly just viewed by industry. Fans don't really look at our Instagram. So I think that's probably important, and kind of, because that, just anecdotally, I hear a lot of people kind of getting jobs, or becoming known, through, you don't have to have a massive TikTok or Instagram, but just kind of existing in those worlds. So I think that's probably something I would change and do differently if I was, that age. And I think I think you've got to just work harder than, I personally, and hopefully I'm not so old that it's meaningless. I'm still impressed when I see, we deal with a lot of young managers and early 20s and things. And when I see that hustle and people going out to shows kind of 4 or 5 nights a week, which is exactly what I did, but, I still am impressed. I think that's because you get to a point where that's perhaps not possible anymore. So that's kind of something. And I just think being a timely responder, I know it sounds so basic, but I can't tell you how often, and it really is meaningful when you have those relationships where people, even if the answer is no, and certainly is a lot in our game, the answer is no, people coming back and saying, sorry, can't do it this time, and this is why, as opposed to, and I really try and do that. I'm not immune to that, but I really try and, make a point of doing that, but it's certainly an interesting time to break into our industry because, a lot of, certainly at the major companies, sadly, a lot of A&R people have been replaced by data analysts, have been replaced by, there's before, when I was starting, the first thing you did was listen. First thing you did was listen to a record. Now there's 5 steps before you even listen. You look at the chart metric data, you look at the PDF, you look at, sometimes I'll be on a Zoom call. This sounds really cynical and horrible, but I know I'm not the only one who does it. you hear an artist's name that you've never heard before on a Zoom call, and obviously you can't listen because you're on the call, whatever. But, by the time I've looked at their Instagram, TikTok, Spotify, just the silently, I think I have a pretty good picture of like what the artist sounds like from promo shots, what the art, because I have done it a lot. So and occasionally 1% of the time you'll be wrong. And your preconception will be wrong, but at 99% of the time, and you have a sense of like what size the artist is, and so it's a different world now where you go through these steps, and then there's only so many hours in the day. You're like, okay, I better listen to that, I better get into that.
Any more? Well, we're gonna come into land. We still have coffee in the pot. We still have some croissants, and we still have the opportunity to kind of get to know each other. But would we all take a moment to thank Mark for sharing his story?